Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we conclude a two-part series on housing in the United States and the reality of racial profiling as something very deeply embedded for a very long time in the very structures of policy at the federal, state, and local levels. Also codified into law so that the people of color, immigrants from around the world have been systematically excluded from one of the most basic needs that all human beings have, and that is a need for belonging and a need for home. So we're going to be going a little bit more deeply into that domain today. But before we do, let us just pause and begin our program with some conscious, coherent breathing, which we do as we begin each one of our sessions. So in a moment, you'll hear the sound of a bell. When you hear the sound, just breathe in very slowly for about 5.5 seconds. You'll hear the sound of another bell, and just breathe out for about 5.5 seconds. We're going to take 10 breaths together, and then we'll begin our program. Thank you all so much, and welcome to Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. Now it's my pleasure to bring back April DeSimone, who's the founder of the Democracy Project and works at that interface between architecture, the built environment, and social policy, and has been one of the national leaders in the United States and really seeking to align in a much more equitable and a transparent way, how we enable people, citizens of this democracy, to develop the kind of housing and sense of belonging that everyone needs, but done with racial equality in mind rather than racial discrimination. So April, I just want to acknowledge the very hard work in a very intractable area that you've taken on with your work, but you're making extraordinary headway, and I just want to acknowledge you before we begin and welcome you to Humanity Rising.
Kim, thank you so much. I really appreciate the energy, the frequency to vibe in at Humanity Rising, and the wonderful conversations and exchanges that are happening both during these sessions and to hopefully resonate and reverberate beyond. I'd also like to welcome Ann Robertson on sort of my co-conspirator in this work of how we take democracy values or democratic values and really create agency block by block throughout the country to really say, how do we spatialize these concepts? The story, again, just for those who weren't with us yesterday, of how people from different backgrounds, and can share her background, but it's this real coming together that people are realizing as many points through the timeline of democracy before, that we need a rising in concepts of equity or equality or justice that have been marred and tampered with as a result, whether it's religious, racial, class, gender, all different forms that have really, again, created these enormous gouges and infractions to the future hope of democracy. And it's always great to share space with, as I said, a co-conspirator in this.
Well, yeah, thank you, April, and thank you, Jim, and to everybody at Humanity Rising. Yeah, no, we April and I met through being board members of an organization called the American Sustainable Business Network. And when I first heard about her work a little over a year ago, or a little less than a year ago, and really then when we actually connected, I'd heard about it, had really piqued my interest enormously. And then finally we met in person at the end of the year at a conference and board meeting. And then 2 months later, when she called me and said, I'd love to tell you more. I said, I am so interested and so in awe of what she has done and is creating and now co-creating with others as well. And we share this much in this, not only our mutual interest in policy that supports an inclusive economy and an economy that works for all, but also these values that are so inherent and so important in maintaining our democracy. And we're seeing such threats to our democracy right now. And just a brief history as to why it resonated when I first heard about the practice of democracy was of two family members in particular who at different times and in different areas held up, and risked a lot, quite a bit, to support and uphold democratic values. One was my great grandfather in the business world, and then my uncle in the political world. Tragically, he died of a massive brain tumor at the age of 34, and he was at the upholding the values of equity and inclusion, and really stood. He died in the early 70s. Was inspired by many civil rights leaders, as well as Brown versus the Board of Education, to support a more fair and truly level playing field in the educational and public schools arena. And he was just on his way, as many people thought, to become the next governor. And from there, we never know. But his life was cut short. And but he took quite a bit of risk at that time, particularly with folks at that the state of Virginia who were very, very pro-segregationist, both in the political as well as the business worlds. And just before he died, he gave a speech to some of the most powerful people, again, people in the more in the segregationist camp in both the political and business world, and really to send a very strong and clear message that it was enough, time was over, and it was time to move on. So then he died, as I said, quite tragically 2 years later. But then my great grandfather did in the business world took quite a few risks and stood up for democracy at a crucial time. And just excited to be here on this session of Humanity Rising. April, you want to take it from here?
Yes, no, it's again wonderful to have a second opportunity to engage this conversation. Yesterday, we went through a timeline as celebrating this historic moment where President Lyndon B. Johnson signs into action or law the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and sort of looked at the journey of this concept of in pursuit of home, not only the structure of a unit or a property, but also where the ecosystem of home informs that value exchange of shelter and a right to shelter, and understanding that. So today we're going to continue this conversation, but really take these broad strokes that we learned about yesterday, whether it was, again, the redlining maps, underwriting manuals, the real estate industry, the highway industry, and look at it from a community perspective. Like, what did this mean? And what were the nuances of how it begins to affect, again, the very neighborhoods and streets that we all call home, and this concept of home and sort of meeting human needs and these concepts that we hear more and more today, the social determinants of health, how home is sort of centered in the midst of this. And for us to grow even as a species, or our humanity, that our ecosystem that we are entrenched in informs, again, these democratic values. And if we're not ascertaining them, what is the future hope or stewardship of, again, these concepts of equity, equality, and justice? So I'm going to take you all to the neighborhood that I called home. It's the East Tremont section of the Bronx, New York. And again, as I shared before, growing up where close to 80% of my ecosystem of home, again, was ravaged by fire and disinvestment, and literally living in rubble, I think really begins to accentuate or spark the tale of two democracies very, very early on, similar to what kids today accentuate as their experience. And it's not that only areas of East Tremont suffer. I think there's a disconnecting and an unraveling of the social fabric of society, period, when we have these stark contrasts of how we, again, reinforce hierarchy of human value. And that disconnectedness breeds a lot of what we're seeing. So again, this impetus to understand your neighborhood, your ecosystem of home really becomes important. And I encourage you all, what you're seeing in front of you is called a Sanborn map. And it begins to tell a story, a narrative around what's in place and space, and how do we navigate and live within the built environment. Because again, it's not that someone snaps their finger and something pops up, although it feels like that sometimes. It's that there's intentionality and decision making and planning. And unfortunately, a lot of times at that table, who is sitting at that table, and what, again, are the psychologies that they're bringing in to space. I ask that you follow this Google bubble or marker, and it'll tell this story of transformation to this community. And, you know, around the 1800s, what you see is, again, what we talked about, still an agrarian economy and landscape with low density and no development. And you see sort of ecosystems, who was there, what services were provided, the walkability of communities. As we know, Edgar Allan Poe himself lived not too far from the East Tremont community in the Bronx. And when you begin to look at, again, this marker of East Tremont, we know the advent of switching from this agrarian economy to industrialization begins to see the proliferation of density and neighborhoods and what we call urban cores, and how the raw materials from the South were fueling what was happening in the industries and factories of the North. And you see here, again, just a footprint of the environment of East Tremont. You see the Metro North line, which is a rail line that goes into Grand Central Station. And you just see these ecologies of churches, schools, vaudeville theaters, and it shows these very intact ecologies that, again, you know, have the dynamics within them. We look at, you know, it's so fascinating to see over time the types of housing typology, home that existed in places from multifamily to single family to, as we see in the building here, multifamily units or two-family units in the other picture. And you see sort of these public amenities or these neighborhood amenities like a movie theater. This is the Tremont movie theater that really begin to anchor these communal points within a community of connectivity, of being on a block and understanding who's in your neighborhood. They had amazing vaudeville theaters in Tremont. This is the Metro North subway station or train station that, again, even activated components of economy through local business ownerships within them, not to mention the Art Deco architecture. I, find this stuff breathtaking and beautiful because, again, the aesthetic speaks sort of the caliber and quality of a community. You had these local lending institutions, we touched upon this yesterday, that lent locally, that were engaged in the community. People called it yesterday the People's Bank, and sort of deconcentrating this, a conglomerate around our banking system, that these were, again, locally owned. But just look at the architecture of these spaces and the care of this ecology. You had these vibrant corridors. A lot of the business owners and shop owners within this ecosystem of home lived within the Tremont community. And you had, again, transportation, schooling, walkability, neighborhoods. We, in this particular area with the first city hall for the Bronx when it becomes a county, and it's called Bronx Borough Hall. To the right, you see a piece of the 3rd Avenue L subway line, which was only a few blocks away from the Metro North line in Tremont. And what's fascinating is that this train line ran from the northern tip of Manhattan around Harlem to the most northern tip of the Bronx. So it was a major transportation corridor, particularly for the working community who could not afford the Metro North, which was more of the families coming from the outer rings of the suburbs of Westchester County and other places that would take and bypass areas like Tremont. And, the stops weren't as frequent as the 3rd Avenue L. But I, pay close attention to just green space, the architecture, the quality of investment that goes into these areas. And as we briefly talked about yesterday, I think when we look at redlining maps, which is what's in front of you here, and for those of you who weren't with us yesterday, redlining maps have been around since the first boats landed because it's about confining and constricting and labeling value to communities. The colors are green, blue, yellow, and red. Green and blue are most valuable for investment and preservation, and yellow and red, not so much. Yellow would become red in 2 to 3 years. And as I said, they would study the migratory patterns of neighborhoods who would cycle out. Green and blue were protected by restrictive deeds and covenants, which were stipulations, whether through documents or through a handshake, that said you would never allow what would be considered detrimental influences to live in this area. As I said in following this Google marker, when you look at places of the intact ecologies of Tremont, it's incredible that someone sat at a table and made a classification that these areas were hazardous, were not worthy of investment. And not only was investment not going to come in, but we will see what this classification tees up these communities to become. And again, it's not that the advent of this was just under the New Deal policies. Again, one of the greatest social welfare programs of this country that creates essentially the American middle class, but it's that it's done under the auspices of democracy, and it's done under power of people and putting in positions to steward these ideologies and principles, again, making decisions for our entire country that we're experiencing the collateral consequences of such. And the power that they had to deem such intact communities as being less than or unvaluable. And here's where the pivot, as people are migrating out of the urban because of the public campaigns that were being taken around slums. It's highlighted in West Side Story, the new iteration, this concept of bleeding out cities because they're dying. They're not worthy of value, and that everything is going to happen outside in the suburbs. And again, this conscious decision by planners, architects, bankers, insurance companies, it was, again, as I said, everyone had their hand in the cookie jar to forward this sort of narrative. And as we know, again, studying, as I mentioned, studying the migratory patterns, as people begin to exit out into these newly developed suburbs, that sometimes the mortgages, or many times the mortgages in these newly developed areas were less than the rents that a lot of people were carrying in places in urban cores. So again, the fascinating opportunities that begin to open up for people like my mother, who begin to leave the dilapidated, overcrowded conditions of Harlem and begin to look for opportunities in places like the Bronx, and what it all means for them. It was this chance to say, I can get my slice in this cherry pie after being denied for so long. But unfortunately, as they're coming into places like the Bronx with the intact ecologies of those pictures that I shared to you, that's the inspiration of their vision. But what they're met with is predatory lending practices. So because of their identity, they don't even qualify for the 15 to 30-year mortgage that many of us are familiar with, that was the advent of the New Deal that, as I said, essentially creates the American middle class. But what they have are contract buys, where you don't fully own the home. You have to, it's like a rent-a-center. If it breaks, you still have to pay the payments, or you lose it. Mentality. They had higher down payments and interest rates, the same 5 to 7 year term, and punitive measures. You could lose your entire investment into a place should you miss a payment. So when people like my mom come into places like Tremont, this home here in the forefront that I'm highlighting with my cursor is what's involved again in this really beautiful ecosystem of Tremont in the Bronx. And again, shortly and unbeknownst to this migration coming in, and there's a great book called Race for Profit that talks about sort of the predatory practice in setting up homeowners or property ownership for failure. Because shortly after moving in, we see that the Cross Bronx Expressway begins to rip through communities like Tremont, creating an environmental hazard and beyond. And we can argue about the value of transportation, but when you're given alternative pathways to do this, and you still choose to do it one way, it's just complete disregard of the people who are in this ecosystem of home. And it creates, again, the collateral consequences we're dealing with today. And simultaneously, as we're having massive infrastructure through policies of urban renewal and slum clearance, we see the places of the Bronx losing value. Cities begin to go on the verge of bankruptcy, including New York City, and sort of the bailout is not happening. And what you see is then exploitative and violent practices emerge. So all those X's around the Google bubble where my mother ends up purchasing her home are indicative of the fires that begin in the Bronx. So all of the infrastructure around this home and her dreams of in pursuit of home are literally up in flames. And all that ecology of what was of value becomes normalized in our communities and everyday occurrences. The infrastructure, this is the picture of the 3rd Avenue L that begins to be torn down. We can never invest in an infrastructure project like this because the costs are astronomical. But the fact that they wanted under Patrick Moynihan to create the benign neglect policy of planned shrinkage, where we make these areas humanly uninhabitable, take out the value and put them into the green and blue areas to, again, save cities that were on the verge of bankruptcy, again, is a psychology of dehumanization, of saying who was more worthy and who was less deserving of this concept of in pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In doing this, it creates a transportation vacuum for the working community who could not afford the Metro North, and now had to find alternative ways to travel longer time travel or distance to get to work through buses or what was actually available. And then we see just this entire advent of what occurs in our community. And despite what Jimmy Carter comes and equates these areas to World War II, we see the proliferation of, even in this chaos and in this gouging and this genocide, it's this, resiliency of community to say we will not go. And we see RFK come out. And we see a lot of activism and movement around what's happening. Here's Gail Sincata, who's one of the framers of what becomes the Community Reinvestment Act. And she's doing this from San Francisco, or not San Francisco, I think it's actually Chicago or San Francisco. But how do we begin to stop the gouging of cities? And we know President Carter signs a vast legislation under the Community Reinvestment Act to how to bring value back into these communities. And we see that redlining is attempted to be addressed in these areas, and the intentions of CRA to again sort of cure or heal sort of this gouging that's taking place. And then we have subsequent legislation similar to Fair Housing Act, but they don't fully get their teeth. And then in 2008, we see a foreclosure crisis that really comes to unveil sort of what has happened with CRA and how has CRA benefited or not benefited communities. And we see the growing racial wealth gap, who gets loans from CRA, and then what's the new legislative act. So again, even though we had these components that we're trying from a legislative perspective, continue the pipeline of the curing. So we see that even despite this attempt, the devolvement of the infrastructure within these communities. As I mentioned before, these local economies that comprised of local business owners like a movie theater, which exists ironically in many smaller communities like Bronxville, which is just north of the Bronx, but it's part of Westchester County, that infrastructure was worthy of, again, because it's a green and blue area, that people come into these areas to live, Princeton, because of these intact ecologies and amenities and walkability, that we have these in every major city in America, and we rip these things out. So now this movie theater eventually becomes a garbage refusal site. And today, ironically, because of the health or food choices within this area, is now a dialysis center. So again, the infrastructure and the architecture begins to tell a story of, again, these spatialized psychologies of inequity within our communities. So it's this degradation. The bank that, again, anywhere else would have had the opportunity for preservation efforts, literally, they take the windows off and let the elements come in so that they could just erase it and build very poor quality housing on top of it as an infill today. That Metro North train station, the beautiful Art Deco architecture, is completely gone. It doesn't even exist. It went from serving this purpose to just being boarded up, to then for a time, this train never stopped at Tremont, and then it became a hazard because it started crumbling into the train track. And then you see these once vibrant corridors cinder blocked essentially, and sort of taken away from the ecology of what we live in. And that home that people like my mom, or that block of, again, this pursuit of wanting something different. This is the home I grew up in. This was my green space. This was my environmental bubble. And we grew up in 3 rooms with a kerosene heater and no running hot water, because people like my mom really believed in this concept of pursuit of home and put all what she had into a home, and into a neighborhood and into an existence, and didn't have the resources to leave once everything started imploding. And there's a complicit nature that, and cognitive dissonance, that you sit and you wonder, when you look at sort of this happening in the Americana, where were you in these moments? And reflect on that. What were you experiencing? What were you contributing to? And how was this okay? And for me, it's always been an oxymoron with equity, equality, to understand that not only is this the experience that I'm experiencing, but even in community, or I experience in communities like Trenton, it's even worse because the infrastructure is even more decayed, and you still have children growing up in places like this. So what has happened that we have allowed for all of this to occur and not leveraged the power of the we to say, even though there's legislation, we know what's happening on the ground. And there is a collateral consequence. There's concepts of nostalgia, which is really a mental impact to the rapid transformation of your community. It's raised in conversations when we talk about World War II. It's raised in conversations when we talk about Paradise City in Ron Howard's film. But the irony is that it wasn't raised in places like the Bronx, where these gouging and rapid transformation of violent transformation of our community took place. And this amazing quality architecture and infrastructure just devolves into nothing. And then we get to sell a narrative that we need to be tough on crime and blame the people in the community that these conditions are occurring, similar to what we do today, that concept of we need to bring them to heel. We see this like urban decay, and again, it's not just an unraveling of the fabric of the social fabric of Tremont, it's an unraveling of the American fabric, of these hopes and aspirations for, again, the dreams that are rooted in democratic values. And we see the rise of the campaigns to vilify and criminalize communities like Tremont, whether it's this false narrative of the welfare queen, or this broken windows theory, or people like Lee Atwater, who, again, despite political affiliations, because everyone was doing this on both sides of the aisle, you can have people say openly what their Southern strategy in this case was, and that there wasn't any pushback in creating the ripples outside. And again, we are experiencing as a massive genocide, and we're being told to just say no. And we're seeing just our community and this concept of ecosystem of home just unraveling. And if you read this quote, again, how do you not sit and think that this is a threat to our collective democracy? And now what's happening is that in places like Baltimore, North Philly, Trenton, the Bronx is untouchable. Now, because people deemed it valuable and they want to control their authorship and their narrative of value, investment has poured back in, led again by the government, just like the New Deal, to rebuild many of these areas. But even though all those empty blocks in the Bronx have been rebuilt, the Bronx is still the poorest in health outcomes in all of the 62 counties in New York State. And it tells you this concept of, even though the aesthetic is poorly built because the quality is never to what it was before, it also shows that even though it's here, the tremendous disparities and inequities that are existing. And again, it's owned by a few that then are extractive and exploitative to the economies that are in these spaces. So it's now we're all living in the midst of a new redlining, because it's not only a serial displacement of people and cultures and lived experience, but it's an economic redlining, because these once affordable communities are no longer affordable to the people who have been on the front lines for generations. So a lot of the work, again, that Anne and I are centering sort of this ecosystem of home on is really looking at a pedagogy, process, and practice. How we learn can shift the way we do things through process, and how through process we can inform through practice. And these are just a couple examples of the work in the Bronx, New York. and other areas that really begin to say, how do we get to the systems that have created this? And one way, when we speak of pedagogy, in addition to the traveling exhibition, the practice of democracy, we do a curricula in community. And it's this concept of how we design a we. We begin with exhibitions and local stories. And here we work with youth 14 to 21 that really began to look at their environment and look at sort of how did we even get here? And then what is the dream that looks at equity through this, through the lens of democracy and equality. And it was brilliant to see how they take ownership. But I think what was really powerful was to see how they saw their community and had no idea of the histories of Tremont that I shared with you in the initial slides, and that there was this sigh of relief of this mental freedom, that they weren't the reason why their community looks and is the way it is. And it was a weight lifted to then even begin to imagine, what does it actually mean to steward democracy in this community? We focused our project on one of the last tenement buildings remaining on this block in the Tremont section of the Bronx. And it's how do you repurpose it to serve community needs and ownership and language. And they really delved into sort of all the aspects of community. I think what was incredibly powerful that was accentuated within this youthful group was this understanding around intergenerational healing. That was their conclusion, not mine. That how do we come together to really begin to heal, again, the social fabric of the Americana, to blur these divisions that we all have been subjected to, and these lines and these barriers. And they looked at cooperatives, they looked at maker spaces, and how all of this can really spill out into the community. This building is located across the street where a young man by the name of Khalif Browder lived. If you don't know the story of Khalif Browder, you should look, it's on Netflix. It's a film that really highlights how a 16-year-old child was falsely accused of stealing a backpack and held for almost 3 years in solitary confinement. When he is released and vindicated of not doing the crime, his psychological and mental well-being was so degraded that he ultimately commits suicide. And the story begins to track the impact that it has not only on his immediate family, but everyone in the community. And then not too far from here is where a young man was macheted and caught on camera and dies running to St. Barnabas Hospital. So again, how violence has been sown into the roots, but that there was hope for healing, because there is this belief that the consternation of violence or inequity comes from somewhere. And many of them attribute it to civil liberties and rights and value systems. And they got to envision sort of how they wanted to see their space. While we didn't get the project, we fell $200,000 short of this project. Of $1 million. The building was unfortunately torn down, and now it's just a blank slate of a park that really is not bringing this residual value, but has been sold as green space in the community. The upside of this story is that 3 of the youth that were part of the group have gone on to architecture, planning, or law school, and now are coming back into the community to look at another place that this project can possibly live in. Another project we're working on or worked on was NYCHA, Public Housing Infill Project in Brooklyn, New York. And with this, again, we worked with a developer who at this point wanted to understand from his language, how do you actually spatialize racial equity in the built environment? And we worked internally with the development group to really begin to shift their perceptions and mental models of the communities that they work in. And what we told a story over time of what was here where the site to develop was going to be. And right now, it's again a narrative of disinvestment, criminalization of poverty. But it was like, well, what was here before even public housing came up? And we showed that this was actually a free community of Black and brown people that own hundreds of acres in this area, and that the first Black woman doctor for New York State came from Weeksville and the community. And again, looking at Sanborn maps, the ecology and ecosystem of home that existed and served as refuge when the draft riots and the lynchings happened in New York for the Civil War. And then it shows sort of the integration of this community of all different ethnicities and diversities, and sort of the different businesses, back to the point of what we showed in Tremont, that again, these were intact ecologies that just needed some uplifting of investment. And what would have happened had they just increased the density on top of the housing versus the removing of all of these blocks and cordoning off walkways and spaces. And we told the story of, you know, what happens if we reactivate the streets that were closed off, that has again created a fence around this community as pariah. We looked at how do you reactivate circulation pathways. They had amazing public artwork from the PWA era of the New Deal that hired artists to come in. We looked at other typologies that matched this concept of public housing. And we showed that it's interesting that this is Stuyvesant Town in Manhattan, that if you look at how Stuyvesant Town, which is no different in the typology of public housing, but all their commercial spaces on the bottom have daycares, cafes, co-working spaces, theaters. And why is that design aesthetic acceptable there, but in these areas that we want to reinforce a narrative of spectacle continues? And so we challenged the design aesthetic. We said this concept of luxury is a false narrative, and that you can create something incredibly beautiful and accessible and activate the same ground floor spaces, which is what we did in the internal piece here. That shows it was a senior housing, but we also said, instead of putting a food pantry or a soup kitchen, how can you do a food cafe in this area that again can address food apartheid or food access issues without the spectacle of people lining up on the outside with their carriages? So it really became, just for this RFP phase, an ability to look at how we actually can change the root issues. And you know, it's hard to see, but we follow this navigation of what is at the core that's shaped by our perceptions and mental models that fuel power and relationships and connections, and how does that yield the policies, practices, and investments, and how in all of these systems it's a narrative that starts from perception, and that it creates these systemic challenges born from these macro systems that then impact the determinants of our health in a myriad of ways that come out through cost burden, households, abandoned lots. And what we challenge is that anything we create, whether it's a real estate investment trust, an artisan guild, how does what we're doing really begin to impact the root of systemic inequity that, again, are growing threats to our collective democracy? So we use this as an instrument to really, again, talk about this work, what we're doing, and what we hope we can accomplish with this. So again, this is not about the shaming or blaming of what these histories. It really is about a call to action, that there are real consequences that we're all enveloping and passing to the next generation. And right now, we really need a transformational ecology, that this concept of home is protected, no matter your identity, your gender, your creed, your religion, and beyond. Because if that is that threat, and we are dispersed and there's continuing tearing at our fabric, then how can we ever accentuate a just and inclusive society that is so necessary in order to steward democratic values and principles? Thank you so much.
Wow, April. That was devastating. When one really takes in the enormity of what we're dealing with and the interrelationship between just the housing discrimination and how that spills out into social interactivity and the riots and the foreclosures and the collapse of the markets and all of that. I'm looking forward to getting into that more deeply. But knowing that Anne needs to leave in just a few minutes. Anne, I wonder if you want to come in and make any comment that you would like on what we've just heard from April.
Well, it's just, I don't think there's anybody who can explain it better than April. When I first heard, the all the elements that she's put together, it's really, it's just extraordinary. And as I mentioned, this book yesterday, I didn't have the title, I didn't have the book in front of me, but I read this back to back to another book. And this, the title for this one is Racism in the Neoliberal Era, Meta-History of Elite White Power. And what it helped me to understand, and looking at it from the lens too of what April has really put together with this incredible exhibit, which I saw in Connecticut, and for myself, trying to understand how did we come back to, again, these robber baron days, but it's even beyond that, because again, they've merged with the powerful corporations, have merged with, as I said, some of the segregationists that never went away. And particularly in the deep South and parts of the South where I grew up. But this explanation helped. The author is I don't recall where he's from, a university, but he really starts to unpack how the threat to a more egalitarian and equality, an equal, democratic nation that is both way more representative of this country. But what he helped me to understand is how, he focuses on how the origins, I'm just reading, of an expansion of neoliberalism explains how the white racial frame operates like a web of racial meanings that connect social groups with economic policy, geography, and police brutality. So white private, Black public, and we started to see this as April witness in real time, the divestment of these communities that were really beginning after, Brown versus the Board of Ed, and became law of the land, and then the civil rights era, where just this opportunity and the promise and the hope and the promise for what I believe, was our best chance to create a much more democratic nation, started to be attacked through this economic philosophy that's just taken such deep root. And another interesting book by Nancy McLean, a Duke historian, is Democracy in Chains, the Radical Right Stealth Plan for America. And so just, the opportunity to start to really get the true history through what April has put together is what is really, to me, I think is going to help fight back some of what we're seeing. Not everything, but I think we'll start to, a new narrative is so needed right now, more than ever.
Well, it's absolutely. And this new narrative, is being labeled critical race theory and essentially outlawed in state after state with the banning of books and the intimidation of teachers and families. And that's one reason why on Humanity Rising, we invite people like the two of you. So at least we can do our bit to bring, the truth to power in whatever way that is possible through something like a global broadcast. But I think you're making a fundamental point, Anne, that that this is deeply embedded into this, almost the substrate of American culture and history. And the more obvious it becomes, the more ferociously it's being fought by the people. I happen to know Lee Atwater through a mutual friend back in the 70s and 80s. And I have to tell you, and I'd like to start there, April, with your comments, but he was, I would call him a sociopath. There was nothing that really mattered to him other than winning. And the ambivalence was that I wouldn't say he wasn't really racist, but he understood that using racism was going to enable the Republicans to develop a long-term strategy that would protect their demographic. And in some ways, that's the most cynical racism there is. When the motivation isn't sort of ontological as much as strategic and tactical, because it brings an intelligence to what they're doing that is really devastating, because they began to use code words that like the war on drugs, etc.
Or dog whistles.
Yes. And so I'd love to have both of you comment on that, maybe starting with you, April, because that overlay between racial discrimination in housing with a reinforcing ideology hides it and legitimates it through sort of a benign neglect, which keeps it from the public eye, because they're thinking about stopping crime in these areas, and because it's Black and brown people, those are the people that are the problem. So speak more about that, because I think it's a loaded issue, and it goes into all kinds of areas, but it seems that's a good place to begin.
It's incredible, just the proximity of that language of people like Lee Atwater, and sort of seeing that in action, and that's what we breed a lot of the times in this Americana wheel, and that then they're unleashed to control the narrative of our shared value and our democracy, and the carnage that's left behind. And it's not complicated, Jim. It is. It's again, to this word, dehumanizing, and it's incredibly painful to continue to see generation after generation be impacted by it. And I think that this is what we're trying to get at. Sorry, the camera keeps slipping back, so sorry for the vertigo there. And I think that we need, that's what we need a rising about, because how do they become in positions of power? And how I see them as the minority, they are not the majority. How do they end up controlling so much? And where are we all? And I ask that not in jest, but it's almost reflect. When we take those pause and breathing moments, breathe in. Where were you at this moment of what's happening in places like the Bronx? What did you think of that narrative that was being told, that basically we're animals in spaces like this? But the reality is, it doesn't just hurt the Bronx or my neighborhood. It hurts America in its totality. It hurts democracy. It hurts all of us in some form of way. And we're seeing that today with the opioid epidemic in different communities. We're seeing that with the massive shootings that are occurring. There is this breaking of our collective empathy and understanding of one another. And this is the work. And I think it unearthing this. And again, we have to talk about it, but not talk about it because the end goal, it's not a zero-sum game. And we have to start teaching our youth that there's enough for everyone. It's just the hoarding mentality of selfishness of what has happened. And we need places to come together. They have been obliterated in so many instances. So it's again, it's not just the racial aspect. Everyone has hurt from this. And at given points in history, it's who was convenient for the narrative of othering and pariah, right? And who gets to control. So again, this is the work that we're trying to do, is not just talk about this, but now that we know this, what do we do about it? And for me, what you're seeing in the Bronx, or those images of the Bronx, is happening right now in real time in Trenton, New Jersey, in Paterson, New Jersey. You know, I fought back a choke when you were speaking, Jim, because, you know, to be around people, it just is, it's very hard to look at the hope being lost in their consciousness. Like they don't believe anymore that this applies to them. And that's heartbreaking. I lost a young cousin in December of 2022 to gun violence in Paterson, New Jersey. He was shot in the head. No one knows, but I didn't even trace back to generations of plantation era. And I think that's a unique narrative to come together with different people. Just the extrapolated in a violent way, people rose to power through plantations in this country, right? It was an economy that we all played a part in so many ways. But when you look at just from my grandmother's generation, that's my grandmother, her son, my uncle, my cousin, her daughter, and her daughter's son. That's 5 generations that have been violently assaulted by these systems that we're hearing about. And it hasn't changed for us. Mm-hmm. Where you have the story that we all, you know, again, we all suffered, we had trauma, but some were able to abscond from that and assimilate into something and use families, legacies, and names and identity, right? Some of us can't do that. And more of us have been stuck in this place of incredible pain and hurt, because we don't even, in my family, my generation, my cousins, my first cousin, they're dying in their 50s and early 60s. And to me, it's a testament of what has happened in our communities. We're not even living beyond a certain age. So there's a rage in me that's even being robbed, not only in this moment, but even with the youth. Look at what they're enduring. And we're writing white papers on something that's so simple to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, I was just going to say, because I do have to leave, I just wanted to say thank you and how deeply grateful I am for these conversations that you're holding. They're just so important in helping, I think, bring people around the globe together. And so thank you. And I look forward to future conversations.
Well, we'll be in touch, I'm sure, and be
Yes.
well, and we'll have you back down the trail.
Absolutely. April, we will connect soon. And yes. Thank you to everybody for joining.
Yes.
And I'm so grateful. And I just have to say, I am so grateful for the work April's doing. It just is the most important. Truly, I mean, there's so much, but you have put together something that is just incredible.
Yeah, she's on the front lines.
She is.
No doubt about it. We all are.
Yes.
It's going to make the difference. Thank you so much, Anne. To be continued. Take care. Have a good day.
All right. Bye.
So, April, I'd like to fill out this conversation, because I think it's important, to realize that what we're experiencing today in the United States has been a strategic formulation since the 1970s. We've talked about the Lewis Powell memo and the Nixon Southern strategy, where they mapped out, literally a 50-year strategy to, first of all, negate the importance and the utility of government proactivity in social affairs. And this was taken to its height with Ronald Reagan, that the government was essentially the enemy. and free market and so forth was the only way to do it. So there was a systemic stripping down of social welfare capacities, both at the federal and local level, after the real triumph in the 1960s of the Great Society and so forth and so on under sort of Kennedy and Johnson, and that it was sort of overlaid with this racist ideology that the poor people somehow deserved it. Right. They were people of color anyway, and they really didn't matter. Right. And that they were responsible for most of the crime, so we got to put them in prison. And we began to fill up our prisons while we privatized the prisons. So putting more and more young people of color in prison became more and more profitable. So you have this vicious cycle of the privatization of government functions with a racist ideology that seduced many of the progressives. I'm thinking of President Clinton. Remember, President Clinton came in and he was going to put 100,000 more police on the streets to enforce crime. And then they went after crack cocaine and so forth and so on. So the Democrats and the liberals became instrumental in a ideological strategy that was initiated by the extreme right, yes, but permeated into the mainstream culture. And the final point I want to make, and then have your comment, is that if you look around what's happening today, for example, the assault on women, that ideology now is consuming even the white people that the ideology was initially developed to protect and to somehow elevate. But the mass shootings, the assault on women's rights, the impoverishization of cities and communities all across the country, healthcare. In the 1960s and 70s, America was the healthiest country in the world, and now it ranks 50th under Croatia. So that what we all need to take in is that this has been almost like a suicidal trajectory for American culture. And it always reminds me of what William Durant, the great historian, said, is that civilizations aren't murdered, they commit suicide. And when one looks at the last 50 years of American history, you can just see this slow accident, an accident in slow motion, a slow imploding as we absorbed an ideology that was racist and subordinationalist in its very essence, and now is beginning to consume us all.
It's so profound, and the way you've presented it and framed it, it is an implosion. And while we are imploding, there's a growing force of us trying to say we can't afford for the implosion, because as horrific as these experiences have been for myself and my family, I'm here talking to you and others about the hope of democracy or these value systems. That is sort of, people may not understand it. And I had someone say, there's a book called Freedom's Dominion, and it's talking about white supremacy. And I said, we want to sort of, it's there, that's certainly an element, but it's not the only element in this mix or this concoction that has created this imploding of value systems, and it's global. And I say this very, very, very clearly, that if we lose that hope of what, again, embodes consternation within us when something is unjust, what is then the future? It's like almost like I feel we're navigating into that movie, The Purge, where it's the purge all the time. Like, if you don't like something, I'm going to shoot someone and just kill you, and that's it, and keep it moving. We've lost our values that really, arguably for a very long time, since the first votes landed, but it's just devolved into a way where if we don't begin to push back and not just rely on government, but rely on each other to say, what is common sense here?
Yes.
How can we do this without this pipeline that we know is so corrupt and ensnared right now, that the hope of democracy is us. That's the hope that I'm putting the value system or into the equation, that our everyday actions is a practice. It's what we say we want it to be. And the more of us that are in alignment, because there's such disconnect, the more we have spaces like this to say, look what happened. Look, who do you know that we can make part of this conversation? Who do you know here? And how do we blur these lines that have kept us apart for so long and really advance these principles on the ground, in the street, that then create the groundswell that's so necessary, because we haven't had that. And when people say, well, Barack Obama, President Obama, he brought that forth, Jim, for us, whether it manifested, but that's one person in one space. It was for us to then, also keep that alive in the ways that when we said, this kind of looks like the same thing of coming into disinvested communities and building, mixed use housing, that doesn't seem like everyone, that's going to benefit everyone. We all bought into it, right? Well, not all of us, I did, but it's like, no, that you can't do it like this. You can't just knock down public housing and rebuild and say it's for everyone, because we have a labor issue and a wage issue and an income issue. Why aren't we addressing these things? And why aren't we deconstructing this concept of value, that we are at a state, just like we were with the Great Depression, that if we don't step in and stop this labeling and hierarchy, like you said, we're not going to exist. And many already believe we don't exist as this beacon of democracy that we have served for so long.
Yeah, well put. I think you've said a number of things that are so important to underscore and elaborate on. One is that democracy now depends on us. And in a very fundamental sense, our backs are against the wall. And I been so delighted at watching the events that are transpiring in the state legislature in Tennessee, as this, white racist machine in one of the southern states wouldn't even allow a legitimate protest on a massive gun violent event. And the three people that were involved, one white woman was just sort of reprimanded and sent back to her seat, and the Hispanic legislator and the black legislator were expelled. And then watching the unbelievable surge of public awareness and invitation to the White House and Kamala Harris going to visit them there. It was just an extraordinary thing. And when those young men were speaking, I thought, these guys could be president, these guys. So you had that Obama phenomenon of the highly articulate, passionately clear energy coming through. And now, one of them has been reinstated, the other one's on his way. So that's been an example of what you're saying, that even when it seems that everything is hopeless, somebody pops up with a message that is just extraordinarily clear. And then that resurrects hope in all of us one more time. And we realize that we've got to get down into the trenches and we've got to keep doing what we're doing, because that's the only thing left for us to do.
Again, so well put, Jim. And I really, that's the aspiration, right? We know sort of the bleeps on the timeline, as I said, of democracy, but it never was without a fight, that we never went quietly into the night. And I think more than ever, that's on the line now, that we make that noise. And I think what was so inspirational with the Tennessee experience was just seeing all different people coming together as they did for that march in 1963 on Washington, and saying, no, we are here, we are going to stand up, and we are going to push back. And that's what's needed. that it's almost to this point where we begin to blur or deconstruct these social constructs of division, of identity. It's that everyone is coming together around saying this is unjust and this cannot happen. And these men in this room or these women in this room that promote this, it's not because you're white that's the problem. It's that you are missing a core value or values within you of equity, of inclusion. It's a bad person is not predicated on your identity or color. A bad behavior is just bad behavior, and that some of us are infected by it, and others see that you just can't live that way, right? We call it what we call it in different forms, but watching that young man walk back into that legislator and those faces, it's just faces to me of darkness, of not because of their identity, it's the darkness of what's trying to be casted upon this concept of we the people, and it's not going to fly. And you know, I think of that moment in the Korean War where they're lifting that flag up, and people, you know, becomes a symbolic gesture. That's to me, I invoke that image and that energy. I read the book The Greatest Generation by Tom Brokaw, and you can't not want to celebrate everything in that book. It's like, yeah, this is what it's about, but it's kind of like you left a whole history out of this too, this book. And it's like, but all of that is what I feel and my family feels. And when do we just merge that together and stand up? And what hope that gives us of what democracy outside of a voting booth can actually mean in our neighborhoods and on our grounds. And I often get the answer, really, democracy, April, or this pushback, like democracy is done. And it's like, yeah, it's maybe for a person like you who has benefited from how democracy chose you in the way we currently celebrate it. Now that you got your goods, you can say it's no good anymore. And it's like, no, I'm fighting for it because I believe in it, because I didn't get my savor of what it could actually be. And I believe that we can do this because and again, it's all of us coming together. And that's what we're going to need, is all of us, not in our isolated corners, not marching one day and then isolating back into the boundary of our neighborhood. It's saying, no, your neighborhood is my neighborhood. My neighborhood is your neighborhood. My conditions are your condition, and it's unacceptable.
Yeah. Well, in that spirit, because I think you're absolutely right. You know, every crisis is an opportunity, and you are seizing the opportunity out of one of the deepest crises around. So just tell us, itemize or, comment on the various projects that you have underway and where you're seeing the track lines of hope and positive change. Because I think it's very important that we honor both, the depravity that we see, but also the extraordinary progress that's also possible at the same time.
Great question, Jim. The lines that are coming together, I'll go from a nuanced space, is forming, what's block by block is sort of the parent name of the practice of democracy, bloque, and the REIT that we're forming. And it's just this synergy that people are coming together from professions that we have been sold a way to work in a hamster wheel, and know that what we're doing is actually creating damage. And it's those of us saying, there has to be a different way to do this, but having that courage, right? We all have responsibilities, but we're saying we'll make it work somehow. I think that's been the most hopeful breath to inhale. People in architecture and planning, in finance and law, that are really saying, how do we build a foundation? And then people who have dabs of all types of expertise and language, and coming and saying, how do we create healthy ecologies within work, or what we define as work, to promote it? Because I always scratch my head and I'm like, we talk about equity, we go through these engagement processes around these concepts, and then we hand the project off to people within their structure to have not one lick of equity, but they get the RFP, the money to build, and then it perpetuates the same problems in our society. So it's this hope of people coming together, and again, with intentionality, not just saying, okay, I'm showing up for this one thing, knowing that this is hard work, saying, hey, I may not be able to do this, but I know someone else that can help support this. So this concept of cobbling complexity and not shying away from it has been very inspirational, along with the understanding, particularly as I said yesterday, with this finance instrument. Like, we're going to need to build this muscle, and this muscle is going to be able to become the backbone of how we, sort of manifest the work into a different space. And so April 30th, we're doing a filming in Trenton, New Jersey, from a house that is sort of the symbol of this concept of the pursuit of home. And it's completely gutted. It's a raw space, but it's going to give people an understanding in the framing, right? And the irony of the framing of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and our democracy, what's at the root, at the frame of, or the core, the foundation, is a lot of rot that we need to replace, so the house becomes almost personified or symbolic of this. So we'll be filming, and then our goal is to do, soft fundraising through private conversations and using this material. And then we're going to do a public crowdfunding launch on June 13th. As I shared with you, is the day that the Hulk maps, the redlining maps, or HULK, the Homeowners Loan Corporation under the New Deal, is activated into our world, is unleashed into democracy. So the days, April 30th is the last day of Fair Housing Month, and June 13th is sort of a policy that, along with the Federal Housing Administration, drastically transformed the spatial footprint of America. And both days, we're encouraging people to join us in learning more and supporting. It may not be, funding that you may be able to support, but maybe, a lawyer, a real estate lawyer, that's interested in transforming these spaces. How do you connect them to this work? So we'll be sharing a flyer with all this information by Friday this week, and maybe you can blast it out to your network so that people, again, can sign on to this movement.
That'd be our privilege and honor to be able to support you in that way. And on June 13th, that's such a day that lives in infamy, as Franklin Roosevelt would have said, since he was the president who unleashed that. I don't know how consciously or not, but it's, back to this point about the greatest generation. Roosevelt was one of the great presidents, and yet he was responsible for a deepening of racism in America at the same time. And so we always live with our shadow content. And I think that the point that you were making about, there can be these grandiose plans, and then it goes into the infrastructure, and then it kind of disappears. It's that same, I just fixed the gas pipes at Auschwitz, right? I just have my little job fixing gas pipes. I don't know what's going on. I don't really want to know what's going on, because I get my $50 a week doing this job. Yeah. So we're not educated in whole systems theory, in understanding the totality of how our life, our choices interact with the larger ecosystem, and how that larger ecosystem infuses into us. So by the time it's done, we're not making any real conscious choices at all.
That's it.
And we're like Plato's, the allegory of the cave in Plato. We're just watching the shadows at the back of the cave, thinking we're free, but actually we're bound. And so your work, across all these disciplines, is the kind of model of learning and education and social action that all of us need to be inspired by and emulate in some fundamental way. So just make whatever closing comments you would like to make, April, as our 2 days draw to a close, because you're so courageous, as all of us recognize, as Anne was indicating. So I just want to give a final word to you in whatever way that you would like to talk to our global community.
I really, again, am incredibly grateful. My eyes are tearing, Jim, with what you said. It's a long journey, and some days you kind of say, where is that light at the end of the tunnel? But I think this is, bred for the journey in these moments, because you get so many positive feedbacks, and you understand what's at stake when you want to shy away. And I am very fortunate. I can take President Johnson, President Roosevelt, Ella Baker. All of these are heroes to me on different levels of inspiration, as many of you and what you're saying, to understand that we have a journey and we have a trajectory of what we're doing. And it's becomes, we sometimes get into the weeds of so much of the hopelessness. Oh, this is so big. But it's kind of breathing in and out and saying, well, this, we're going to double down, and we'll do it this way. We'll do it this way. And I looked at all of these mass shootings, for example, that were happening, and the one most recent in Louisville. And I did sit and I cried, of course, for the lives lost, the innocent lives. But I felt a profound sadness when I saw the young man's face, as a mother of 5 children. And I feel, whether it was here or the new town in Connecticut, it's so hard to demonize, these the aggressors. For me, it is. I feel like we have failed as a society I don't want to sound cliche, just be able to, wrap in love. Like, it's always so hard and punitive, and I just sat with his face, and I prayed, and for my faith, and and I feel we have to do better, because it's only going to happen more, because people are just, where's the out? Where's that voice of consciousness that says, there's something to aspire for, and it's not this, and that touch point of humanity and empathy that we need. And again, that's so critical to our democracy. So that's the concept of home. It's not a boundary of space or a neighborhood. It's this concept of home, that no matter where you are, you have a default of that understanding and feeling and peace, and that you'll come across people that can put that inside of you. And that's the quest here. And again, I'm grateful to be on this show.
Thank you, April. You are indeed a courageous and wise woman, and we've been honored to have you with us. And however we can support you moving forward, let us know, because as you're just saying in your closing, home is deeper than a place with boundaries. It's the place where you feel belonging without boundaries, because you're connected with a larger totality, and you feel safe, and you feel included, and you feel honored for who and what you are. And you've demonstrated that very powerfully. So I want to salute you and honor what you're doing, and to say that we're with you all the way down the trail.
Thanks again. Thank you, everyone, for your comments, the feedback, and the resources. And I hope this is a to be continued.
Definitely.
Have a great remainder of the week, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, April. And that will do it for us for today, everyone. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box that Stan just put in. And we'll see you then tomorrow, where we're going to turn to another Code Red issue, and that is how we understand what's going on with our youth, and how can we empower our young people to gain some strands of hope in an otherwise fairly bleak world. So that'll be our topic for tomorrow. Bye for now.